In this video, we are going to take a look at Chapter 1, the research problem, and then we are going to pick up in Chapter 2 after the end of this one. So in the research problem, we're really looking to establish a foundation for your dissertation, and we're looking at doing that by defining the key research problem and considerations. So the two big components that we are going to be working on will be the research questions and the research problem and the components that it takes to be able to do those two things. So first we kind of need to define some of these key ideas. And so a research approach is the plan and procedures for research that include steps from your assumptions to being as specific as the data collection, analysis, and interpretation that you're going to use. This would encompass either your qualitative, your quantitative, or your mixed methods. So I could say my research approach is something as broad as a case study, or I could say something like my research approach is quantitative. I'm going to collect survey data from teacher candidates at a local university, and then I'm going to complete an ANOVA analysis. So a research approach can be articulated in a very broad manner or in a very specific manner. When I'm talking about research designs, those are procedures for inquiry that are within a research approach, so kind of like a sub-bullet of those. And those would be the strategies like experiments, surveys, ethnographies, and case studies. So these terms are used somewhat interchangeably because you might see someone say my research approach is a case study, or like I said before, you may see someone give the very detailed component. So the key is that the research design a lot of time is absorbed into the approach. So we approach a case study in a very similar way where we're observationally looking at something. So that one, if I say my research approach is a case study, that's kind of why it fits in both categories and can be so broad, is because it's sort of interpreted a very specific way. Your research methods, again, are a subset of those approaches, and that's how you're going to do your data collection. That's your analysis type, your interpretation, etc. So your research approach could be quantitative. It could be that you're going to use survey data, which is your research method. It could be, and it's also your design because you're using surveys. And so you would keep drilling down until you get this really specific statement. The research problem is the issue or concern that's addressed in the study, and that actually guides your approach, your design, and your methods. So a lot of times when we're seeing that approach, it's going to be super broad, but where people go wrong is they start with the approach and they don't start with the problem. So what we need to do is identify the problem, then work backwards with, this is my problem, I need to figure out my approach. In order to figure out my approach, I've got to know my research design, then I have to know my research methods, then I can articulate my approach. So these are somewhat, I guess, out of order on the slide, but that's kind of the process, and they're all very iterative because as you're looking at your research design, you might realize that I thought I was going to do a case study, but I can't actually observe people doing this. So maybe it needs to be an experiment or a survey, which then is going to trickle down in the effect. So these are also very iterative ideas. There are 4 philosophical assumptions and worldviews that you should be aware of that guide how you think about research problems. And they're typically something that we want to be very clear and articulate them. You can also find these in the Cresswell textbook. Basically, there's post-positivism, which really looks at empirical observation, measurement, and testing of theories. This is pretty quantitative in nature because you're testing a hypothesis and verifying a theory. Constructivism, however, really focuses on understanding the meanings that individual groups ascribe to experiences. While this is often thought of as qualitative because you're looking to understand something, it doesn't mean the only way to do it is qualitative. I am a constructivist and I've done plenty of quantitative work within the field because I'm trying to understand how something predicts something else. I'm trying to understand if I introduce an intervention, is there a significant improvement in what I'm seeing? So don't get caught up in the textbooks mentioning that constructivism has to really be or is more strongly associated with qualitative data. Transformative is really oriented towards social change, justice, and empowering marginalized groups. This is kind of where our cycle of education has landed on right now. And we are seeing a lot of transformative work being done in research because we're really trying to understand how societal and systematic components are happening, and then how to recognize that we have systematic issues and then address them. So this often involves collaboration with participants so that you can really address power imbalances, you can really understand their experiences, you can really identify patterns and finding what is systematic, and so that you can bring about change. Then we have pragmatism, which really just focuses on the outcomes and consequences of research. This is a lot of times multiple mixed methods. It could be qualitative and quantitative, and it really just kind of looks to solve a real world problem that could be something like a lack of females in STEM fields. It could be any kind of practical problem solving component that's not just a theoretical trying to understand or test a hypothesis. So I have a couple of examples. And so post-positivism would be investigating how different leadership styles affect teacher retention rates. So I'm going to have a hypothesis that certain styles are going to have significant or statistically significant differences in the teacher retention rates. And so in my study, I would collect and analyze that quantitative data through surveys and other statistical methods to test that hypothesis. In constructivism, I might want to explore how school principals perceive and implement inclusive education practices. I might do this through in-depth interviews, case studies. It could even be focus groups. I could aim to develop my own theory that explains how this behavior and this shared experience is being constructed within their schools. Now, again, it doesn't have to be qualitative, so you could also explore this through other quantitative manners by looking at the data component. But in this particular example, you're getting a lot of insight into the person as an individual. For transformative, I could look at how school leadership can promote social justice in unrepresented communities. The researcher here would be tightly collaborating with community members and educators to really develop and understand leadership practices that challenge the existing inequities and really, at the end of the day, empower those communities that you're partnering and collaborating with. Pragmatism could just be looking at an example of assessing the effectiveness of a professional development program that's designed to improve leadership skills. It's a practical problem that we're trying to solve, and it could be solved a lot of different ways. So when I talk about research methodologies, what I really mean is it qualitative, is it quantitative, is it mixed methods? Remember from our week 1 discussions that qualitative really focuses on understanding meaning. It uses emerging questions that are open-ended. You collect the data in your participant settings. You use a very inductive approach where you're trying to inductively reason based on what they've said. What are the patterns? What are the recurrent themes? How would you synthesize them across multiple participants? And it can be a more flexible report structure. So notice that qualitative research, we do have it in the Bowie handbook, but I would say it is often a more forgiving structure than quantitative research, because in quantitative research, we're using a highly specific vocabulary. We are structuring things certain ways. We have to talk about pre and post hoc testing. We have to use certain sources so that we can cite our statistical information. So it's much more structured. And remember that quantitative really looks at objective theories and trying to look at the relationship between variables, whether it's predicting something, whether if it's statistically significantly different. We're always looking at how these variables interplay with one another. And we are specifically looking at numeric data, and we're looking for deductive reasoning. And again, it is a highly formatted approach. In mixed methods, it's a very interesting situation because it's kind of like you're just ordering off of menu. And again, it's less structured because there's not a handbook per se on like what you can combine and how. So in a lot of ways, this feels more fluid because you're combining qualitative and quantitative data, but you might be combining different elements that are not often combined. It really, though, looks at integrating the data. So you shouldn't think of mixed methods research as I'm going to do this quantitative thing and then I'm going to do this separate qualitative thing. There should be interplay between the two of them, and they should make sense that one either iterates or relies on the other one. And this is going to use very distinct designs where you might be citing theoretical frameworks that explain why you chose the particular ones you chose and why they make sense together. What's really important is you should not start by choosing your research methodology. You really should start with looking at your worldview and recognizing it, and then articulating your research problem. And a lot of times your research problem could be explored in any one of these three ways. So, and a lot of times I can say, okay, what's your research problem? And then I can think of a qualitative way to address it, a quantitative way, and a mixed methods way if I just tweak some of the words. So again, while research methodologies is an important component, it's again just a piece of the puzzle that comes after you've articulated your research problem and questions. And so if we were thinking about connecting this to the design and method, if I'm looking at post-positivism, it could be connected to quantitative research. In this example, a researcher that aligns with that might choose quantitative because it emphasizes objective measurements and testing a hypothesis. So in the example that I gave, we are looking to test the effectiveness of a leadership training program on teacher retention, which is going to address what that post-positivism component is. And then if we're looking at transformative and participatory action research, you might be seeing the researcher there would opt for participatory or action research because they're looking to involve collaborating with marginalized groups to enact social change. So that would look like involving working with minority communities to develop leadership practices that address educational questions. In constructivism, if you were looking at qualitative research, and you'll notice that I've said qualitative with constructivism a couple times, and that's often because it gets typecast so heavily in quantitative. So I'm trying to give you some good examples that might be contradictory to what's out there because it can be done really well in a qualitative setting. They might choose qualitative because they're wanting to just understand something that's happening. So we know that this phenomena is happening, but we don't understand why, we don't understand how, we don't understand what the implications are for it, those types of things. In this case, you might have an example where you're trying to explore how different stakeholders perceive the role of school leadership and how that perception affects fostering an inclusive school environment. So again, this would be qualitative because we are doing an exploration process. So it's a lot more open-ended than if something was quantitative there. And then last, if I'm looking at pragmatism and I'm thinking about mixed methods, again, any of these approaches could use any one of these research methods, really just depending on your problem and how you're articulating your problem. But pragmatists tend to favor mixed methods because they are focused on a practical outcome at the end of the day. And so in order to get that practical outcome, I just can't have something quantified. I have to understand what I'm quantifying and when things are most appropriate and when they work best. So if I'm looking for an example here, I might be combining quantitative data like test scores along with interviewing teachers and students and getting to hear more about the test from their perspectives so that I can really look at an integrated approach and I can really problem solve by looking at the problem as a whole and not just isolating a component of it. Now, you guys have heard me say a lot that in your dissertation, you also have to balance what is feasible for you in your time frame. So for this reason, sometimes pragmatism, mixed methods, comes later on in your research career and it's not as immediate. And so we've kind of looked at those worldviews, which are essential to making sure that you've got a research question that's in a good place. But if I wanted to say, how do I get to these research questions? Then I would say there are 4 steps. The first is identifying your topic, like we talked about last week. So, what are your interests? Doing some preliminary research, narrowing down the topics, doing a little bit more research, and doing that iterative process. After you have whittled that list down to maybe 2 or 3 options, or even fewer if you can, then you're going to formulate research questions. And so these research questions are a little bit different from 810. In 810, we talked about research questions that were specific to your analysis process. So if you were doing a linear regression, you were looking for a research question that used the word predict. If you were doing chi-square, you were looking for a research question that's associate. When I'm building my dissertation as a whole, you have 3 to 4 research questions, and only 1 to 2 of those are based on your analysis. The other ones are the questions you're trying to answer with your study. So as I'm moving through this process of getting my topics, doing some research, narrowing them down, I want to also think about, do I have 3 to 4 questions that I could ask about this topic? Because if you don't, it's going to be problematic to complete the study on that topic for that reason. And so here are some examples of research questions, and you'll notice which ones are related to the analysis, as well as which ones are just related to be very holistic. So, how well do transformational leadership styles predict teacher retention rates in a suburban high school? So, predict is a keyword for a regression. So, this is a research question that is related to that regression model. Now, in 810, I had you guys write very highly templatized research questions, and I said later on we'll take some of those parameters off. And so this is us saying now we can be a little more creative with how we phrase our question, but we still have to see that keyword predict. Now we have, what is the effect of transactional leadership styles on teacher retention rates in suburban high schools when controlling for other variables? This still has the word effect in it, so we are talking about effects, but you'll notice there's nothing about this that's related to predicting something. So this is not based on your analysis choice. This is really just based on, I want to know, what is the effect? And you'll notice it's a research question because it's something that you have to be able to answer. You can't have research statements. They have to be research questions, and your entire study and everything in it has to be a component of answering this question. So these should be very broad, open-ended questions. Then you have, to what extent can leadership styles predict teacher retention rates in the suburban high school? Now, again, we see the word predict, so this is very related to the analysis choice, and this is trying to understand to what extent that those things are predicting. So research questions can be based on the analysis. They can also just be based on your areas of interest and why you're interested in them, but they should always be broad, encompassing questions that you're seeking to answer. So at this point, I'm going to pause because we will be working on research question handout and activity. So if you are watching this as your pre-class assignment, which you should be, everything that we're doing in this activity is the information in this video up until this point. Now I'm going to move on from the research questions into the research problem. And so the research problem is a specific issue, difficulty, gap, or contradiction that your research is going to address. It is more focused than your topic, so it's not general like AI. It's going to have to be highly focused, clearly articulated statement that gives the scope of your study. So something like, this study investigates the impact of different leadership styles on teacher retention in suburban high schools. This is a very specific research problem. We're talking about leadership styles. We're looking at how the leadership styles affect teacher retention. And I've given kind of a preview of who my population is. These statements should also connect with your worldview and your approach. So as we move, remember I told you guys you were going to have to write one sentence that's your research problem. As you expand that one sentence out and we start looking at your worldview and developing your research questions, that's how you get to larger problem statements. But in the example, and also one of the things we'll be doing in this class is trying to get it into one sentence. And then in that same paragraph, we will continue talking about the worldview that we learned about and the approaches that we just learned about. And we would also be tying those questions in. So if I'm trying to get to that research problem, I have to cycle through all of the steps to formulate research questions first. So I'm having to identify my topic, I'm having to do some research, narrow it down, write my research questions. Then I'm going to have to think about my next steps are, what is the significance? So Dr. Fu says this a lot, why? Like, why are you studying this? Why? And so that's why. So why are you studying this? Why is it important to study this? And then also, is it feasible for you to study? Then you need to recognize your own philosophical worldview. And so those are the four that I talked about. Are you post-positivism? Are you constructivism, transformative, or pragmatism? Because that's going to color how you talk about your research problem. Then you're finally going to choose your approach. And remember, my approach is going to be qualitative, quantitative, or mixed methods. And then I'm also going to get more specific in that approach as I go through components of it. So as I'm looking at the research problem, if I had a topic, and my topic was the impact of different leadership styles on teacher retention in suburban high schools, that's my research problem. It's stated in one sentence. It's also my topic, which is leadership styles. If I was trying to kind of figure out how to arrive here or how to expand this, first I'm going to say, well, what is my worldview? Let me do some reflecting and let me think about my worldview. And I've put some guiding questions because, again, sometimes it's just hard to know what exactly and how to arrive here. So I've given you some good guiding questions to help you identify what is your philosophical worldview. For your research approach, again, I've given you some good guiding questions to take a look at here, and how you answer these guiding questions is going to be really important. And then I've given you the significance and the research methods. Now, you'll notice I've put some answers in here. These answers might be very different because they're going to be based on the individual, but I've given you some answers to go on so that we can understand how we get to the next slide. So I'm post-positivism because I'm really looking to test a hypothesis. Because I'm looking to test a hypothesis, my approach has to be quantitative because quantitative is the only one that does hypothesis testing. I know it's worth studying because understanding how leadership styles affect teacher retention, it's going to help us improve staff stability and student outcomes. So again, that larger societal problem is the significance. You can't say my job, my district, my school. It has to be that larger societal problem. And then you have your research methods. So is that going to be a survey? Is that going to be at ANOVA? You're going to articulate all of that out. So before we can get further, we got to identify all these components. And so as we're working together on your topics, I'm going to ask you these questions and you need to have these answers ready for me. So make sure that before we meet, you are identifying what is your worldview, what is your approach, what is the significance, what are your research methods. And so here's a great example. I have that one concise statement. This study investigates the impact on different leadership styles on teacher retention in suburban high schools. I said my problem in one concise statement. Now, what Cresswell says to do is to also disclose your worldview, your research approach, which is going to include quantitative, and then you're going to get into your methods, which is going to be survey data collected across multiple schools. Then you're going to have your analysis. So this is what we are looking to get to, is a statement that in one concise sentence articulates your problem, giving a follow-up statement that includes your worldview, your research approach, and your research method. Then you're going to look at including the analysis. And again, people always want to start with the analysis, but for the most part, for a lot of different research problems, I could go different ways in the analysis. So the analysis is very secondary to this process and coming up with your research problem. So this portion of the video that's gone from the research questions to this research problem, handout, and activity, we are going to do an in-class activity at the start of class on this as well. And that's really going to conclude what we're looking at in Chapter 1.